The first topic I want to cover is tilting planes, which is a question I get asked all the time. So I'm starting by placing an ellipse with a minor axis that leads back to a left vanishing point in this case. At the center point, I create a line that goes out to the circumference, otherwise known as the radius. I'm then creating a plane that has a length and width equivalent to that radius. I then create a line from the center point out to another point on the circumference. We know that it's going to have a length equivalent to the radius as well, since we're starting from the center of the ellipse. To find the width of each of these tilted planes, I just create a line with the same slope coming from the left vertice. Now let's expand this into 3 dimensions. I'm creating a box just in a 2-point perspective. In the same way that we rotated the 2-dimensional planes along an elliptical path, I'm going to do the same with the first plane of the box. The lines that were headed to the right vanishing point are going to rotate to the same degree that the vertical lines are, yet the lines that are headed towards the left vanishing point are going to have the same exact slope as they did before. It takes a little getting used to rotate these perpendicular lines to the same degree, but with some practice, you'll get used to it very quickly. Another point that I want to make that I hope wasn't lost in some of the other perspective videos is that when you rotate boxes, you're sequentially moving the right and left vanishing points. In this first counterclockwise rotation, we generate a left vanishing point, LVP1, that's very close to the center of the image. By contrast, the right vanishing point, RVP1, is very far away. A second counterclockwise rotation brings the left vanishing point even further away from center, and the right vanishing point closer to the center. And in our final rotation, now the left vanishing point is further away from center than the right vanishing point, and those lines converging to the right do so faster than those to the left. This indicates one of the problems that occurs when you draw with both of your vanishing points on the page. The students typically put those vanishing points on either side of the page. They end up almost always drawing forms that are tilted at a 45-degree angle, rather than allowing the form to rotate a full 90 degrees. It's also very important in dynamic sketching for you to be able to draw the other primitive forms. If you're comfortable drawing ellipses, you should be able to tackle cones. What you have to do is draw a line from the center, following the minor axis, and then connecting those perpendicular lines to that center point. The term minor axis typically just applies to ellipses. I tend to use it even for things like pyramids. It's definitely a misnomer, but I'm just describing a line that indicates the orientation and tilt of a primitive form. For a pyramid, all we have to do is create a plane in perspective, which is the hardest part. Then from the center point, create a line emerging out in the orientation of the plane, and connect each of the 4 corner vertices to that center point. And here once again, I'm indicating that blue center line, which is indicating the orientation and tilt of the pyramid. Cylinders are tricky if you're still uncomfortable with drawing ellipses. I think in my first video ever, I actually cover the topic of ellipses. So if this is unfamiliar to you, I would say go back to that video or any other video on the topic and just try to get comfortable understanding how ellipses work. The main takeaway is that the length of the cylinder is going to follow the orientation of the minor axis in each case. I also believe that if you want your perspective drawings to become more dynamic, it's crucial that you learn to freehand all of these individual forms. Spheres will look like circles under any perspective. However, we ascribe form to them by indicating ellipses that are tilted perpendicular to one another. The second sphere has an ellipse with a vertical minor axis, and that ellipse curves down, so we can tell that the camera is positioned above looking down at this particular sphere. And last but not least, our good friend the cube. You can review the other perspective videos if you're uncomfortable with drawing cubes. Another point that I want to make about cylinders and the degree of their elliptical faces is that their degree will change depending on which angle you look at them. When you're looking in a side view, the degree of those elliptical faces is very shallow and you see a large majority of the length of the cylinder. However, if it's turned towards you, the degree of those ellipses becomes much wider, but the length of it becomes increasingly foreshortened. When the cylinder is standing straight up and down, the minor axis is also vertical. So you see that the minor axis can be used as an indicator of orientation. Once again, you can see that those cylinders that are coming towards us have very wide degree ellipses, but a lot of their length is obscured by the front face. You can use these ellipses as well to ascribe depth and perspective to organic forms. Just as we turned the two-dimensional circle into a three-dimensional sphere by adding a length, width, and depth, we can do the same for organic forms by adding these ellipses. So I'll start by just placing in some strange blob shape, and I'll draw in ellipses in each of these three axes. The term axial typically corresponds to ellipses with a vertical minor axis. However, when the form starts to turn a little bit, I tend to turn these as well, so you'll see that when I indicate the minor axes. Even at this point, there's enough perspective to see the volume, right? As those ellipses go further down, away from the horizon line, they curve downward more and more. However, just to be thorough, I'll add in those other axes that are going to run in the perpendicular directions. And just as before, if you set your right vanishing point very close, that would mean that your left vanishing point is much further away. So if we imagine both of these curves as having a degree, the sagittal view is going to be much more shallow than the coronal view. This second organic shape, I'll imagine that it's above and tilted at an angle. So what's going to happen is, as we head higher up on the image, the degree of these axial ellipses is going to increase. Also notice that these axes are not actually vertical, they're just following the orientation of the form itself. And once again, we're going to see that sagittal cut as being a very shallow degree, and that coronal cut as very wide and more circular. In addition to just making primitive forms, we can also modify the ones that we've already made. This is very useful in product design specifically. The first modification I'm going to demonstrate is called shearing. This yellow plane will act as a knife, cutting this top corner of the box. Then draw an exploded view where that chunk that's been sliced is elevated above the other parts of the box. This helps demonstrate the separation between the two pieces. You can do this by finding each of those vertices where it's been cut and then just creating vertical lines from there. The next modification that we're going to talk about is extrusion. When you're extruding a form, you're pulling or pushing forms out of one another. So in this instance, I'll just indicate an area in which I'm going to extrude, and then what we're going to do is pull that three-dimensional form out from there. You can do that by creating lines that are traveling away from the left vanishing point, creating more volume. I help indicate the separation by adding a small cast shadow there as well. Now, I discussed a more in-depth approach to rounding forms in part 4 of the perspective series, but usually the way I'll go about it is just a freehand version. All I do is at each corner vertice, I just round off the edge and then continue with those straight edges, and then some contour lines to show how that form is turning. The last modification we're going to discuss here is beveling. Essentially what we'll be doing is taking one of the surface edges and then converting that into two edges. So I'm going to take the edge loop around the top plane, and I create a smaller square and then a larger square in which I connect those vertices together. That produces that beveled edge that you're seeing there. The next set of modifications is really useful for understanding organic movements and organic forms. I'll start by creating a plane that's headed towards our left vanishing point. When we twist this plane, we see that the bottom and top edges are headed towards different vanishing points. So we place in the top and bottom edges, each going to different vanishing points. I'll connect the bottom left vertice to the top right vertice with an S-curve. This creates that reversing of planes effect, so we're seeing both the front and the back. If you spend some time practicing those box rotations we did earlier, this will come somewhat easier to you. Next modification we'll do is take a plane of similar size, and we'll curl the top end inward. This will create outer edges that have a slightly circular nature to them. You can even imagine those lines that are headed back towards the right vanishing point acting as the minor axis for that ellipse we're seeing a part of. As part of this video, we'll talk about what I refer to as ribboning. The way I do this is by taking one of the edges of a flat plane and adding an organic curve to it. In this case, I create a line heading back towards the right vanishing point, and then once I've established my depth, I create that same curve again. Just be aware of the fact that each time you create a peak or valley in your curve, you're going to have to introduce a new line that's headed back towards the right vanishing point. And that about wraps it up for this video, everybody. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope this provided some insight for the perspective techniques that I use all the time. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. I live stream all the time, typically at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, so that will keep you posted as to when I'm doing that. If you'd like to receive more content from me, consider subscribing on Patreon. You can get access to those Gumroad videos at a discounted price or group lessons that include critiques. Take care, everybody.